So it's 10 o'clock in the morning, which means we are starting our webinar today. It has the title Cloud Assessment in Practice, a Guide to Successful Cloud Migration. Very warm welcome from all of us to all our participants. We hope you hear as well. Our presentator today is Jonas Niessen, Director of the Cloud Partner Services, and he will say a few words about himself in a short amount of time. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, any ideas you want to let us know about, then you're very welcome to use the chat function. We like to address all your questions that you might have at the end, and we have also a big question and answer part at the end of the webinar, so you're very welcome to use that tool. And without any further ado, I give it over to Jonas Niessen and to our great presentation today.
Thanks a lot, Juliana, and good morning, everybody, and welcome from my side as well. First of all, I hope that you are all well in these uncertain times and that you and your families are all healthy and safe. That said, I'm really glad that you took the time today to talk with me about the exciting topic of cloud. My name is Jonas Niessen, and I work for T-Systems in our public cloud practice. That means my team and I help customers successfully master their journey to the cloud. And this means that we support companies to define their cloud strategies, to develop corresponding roadmaps, up to the point where we carry out detailed analysis of business applications and workloads to plan a cloud migration and transformation. And this will exactly be the focus of today's webinar. So I would like to start with a few market observations in general to then outline how we can help companies prepare their respective cloud journey. And then I brought a few customer examples that I would like to talk about, and ideally like one or the other in this round can relate to these examples. And then I'll sum up, and then I gladly answer any of your questions. And again, as mentioned already by Juliana, please use the chat function to ask any questions. I'm also very keen to receive your feedback, so leave your comments and questions in the chat. Okay, let me start with a market observation, and this is based on a survey which was conducted amongst 200 IT decision makers from large enterprises. And what we can see here is that the vast majority of these companies have actually started their journey to the cloud, but less than one-third of these companies have actually achieved the expected goals and targets. And that, by the way, is regardless on how advanced these companies were on their respective cloud transformation. So this can really only mean two things. And either the expectations were wrong in the first place, right? Or secondly, and I think this is far more likely, the cloud migration and planning process of the cloud migration needs to be improved. So either way, this definitely means that there's a need for action here. So before I go into a bit more detail and talk about how we can address some of these issues, I would be really keen to get to know the audience a bit better. And therefore, we have prepared a small survey, and you should see on your screen a question now. And what I'm interested to understand is where you currently are on your cloud journey. And you should be able to select from 4 answers. One would be you don't have any plans to go to the cloud at all. Secondly, you plan to migrate to cloud, but so far have no application or workload running in the cloud. Or thirdly, that would be the right answer for you if you have some of your applications in the cloud already. And this could, by the way, include also software as a service offerings, like you're using Office 365 or you're using Gmail or other software as a service offering. That would be cloud, right? And the fourth answer, it should be selected if you're already all in. If you say, like, And by the way, this could be private or public or hybrid cloud deployments, where you say, we don't operate any servers or any data centers anymore. Everything is in the cloud. So I'll give you like a couple of more seconds to select your respective answers. I can see the votes still going up. And then let's give it like 5 more seconds, and then we see what the results really look like. Okay, cool. Hey, thanks a lot for answering these questions. So what we can see here is very interesting. So like 2% of you have answered that you don't have any plans to migrate to cloud at all yet, right? Secondly, 21% of you have plans to migrate to cloud, but have not actually started. And the vast majority, so 77% of you said, like, you have already started migrating to the cloud. And that leaves like 0% for you're already all in. So that's very, very interesting results. And by the way, that also confirms like the market research that we saw earlier, where roughly 80% of the representatives said, or the IT decision makers said they have already moved like at least one application to the cloud. So it's a very representative audience here. And no matter where you are on your cloud journey at the moment, I can promise you that the following content will be relevant for you and hopefully interesting as well. So let me begin by taking a step back and briefly summarizing what we see why companies consider a cloud at all. And our observations can be summarized in 4 main areas. Firstly, operational efficiency, and that means companies want to use the high degree of automation of cloud platforms to become more efficient, to make their operations more efficient. Secondly, cost savings. And this generally includes reducing the total cost of ownership and using the highly flexible pricing models from the cloud providers, where you only pay for what you use, where you can switch from a CapEx to an OpEx model. Thirdly, agility, and that means faster development cycles, getting software releases out there, getting from a few releases and deployments a month to, where necessary, a few or multiple deployments a day, right? And making use of this flexibility of IT resources where I can deploy servers, containers, and database clusters in seconds and minutes on these new platforms. And lastly, innovation. And that means creating real business value and true end customer value through technology innovation. So on the one hand side, we can see 2 categories here which affect and focus on the bottom line and on efficiencies. And on the other hand, we can see 2 categories which focus on the top line and increase revenue and create new business opportunities. And customers I speak to regularly confirm that all these 4 areas are relevant, but also what I hear often is that the short-term focus at the moment is still very much on the efficiency piece and cost savings. And that makes sense because often what I'm hearing is we need to free up some budgets first that we then along the way can invest in innovation and agility along that journey. And that also makes sense when we have a look at this cloud maturity model. And what we can see here from left to right is a typical journey which companies undergo before they can take full advantage of cloud. And that means companies start on the very left-hand side in their own data center with a classic or virtualized environment. And at the beginning, it is so important that companies start thinking about what they actually want to achieve with cloud. So at this stage, time should really be invested to discuss with all relevant internal stakeholders what the cloud strategy actually should look like. And the question to answer here is really, what role should IT play in the future of our business? It's that essential, right? And at the same time, it is important to create transparency about relevant decision criteria. So, for example, which cloud provider fits best to my business and to the strategy that I just formulated? And secondly, how does my cloud business case look like, at least on a high level? So once all of that is decided, companies can then move to the next stage and think about and draw up their cloud roadmap. And this does not only include the technical migration transformation, but also how organizations deal with their processes, how organizations deal with their organizational changes, their people and skills, to actually make full use of all the advantages that cloud technology can offer. So broadly speaking, what steps do I have to take to be able to take full advantage of cloud in the future? And what's important here as well is that not all of these steps need to be addressed at once, but I want to have them mapped out in order to prioritize them on every step of this journey, really. And then once I have completed these two stages and I have a cloud strategy defined, I have my cloud roadmap mapped out, then I can start accelerating the migration itself. Now we can start to set up dedicated cloud teams for the migration. We can start to restructure the organization to form DevOps teams. We can start using cloud technology on a larger scale. And then I'm actually in the process of continuous improvement of this entire setup, because a cloud journey actually never ends, right? But this is probably the topic of a whole different webinar. What we really want to focus here on in the next couple of minutes is how companies can master this first step in order to lay a solid foundation for their cloud journey, in order to not end up in the 2/3 of companies from the market survey that don't reach their objectives and goals with their cloud migration. So let's start with the question, what some of the challenges are on that cloud journey. And on this very busy slide, I have just summarized some of the challenges that I've heard recently from customers during meetings and conversations. And maybe you can relate to one or the other statement here, right? So what I often hear is, for example, that central IT is lacking control. So, and this could be because they're local country organizations which are still responsible for applications and data centers. That could be because innovation is actually driven not within a central IT, but within certain business areas. And this lack of control is so difficult because that also means you have a lack of transparency. So you don't actually have full visibility of all the IT infrastructure and business applications, which makes it so much harder to start planning a larger cloud transformation program. And then in addition, we have all the concerns around pricing, right? These cloud pricing models are very, very complex. So, and there's generally a fear of costs spiraling out of control if I don't have the right guardrails set up from the very beginning. And then there's security and compliance, and we haven't even started to talk about technical challenges and lack of talent and skills and the like. So that means customers are faced with a huge number of options and challenges here. So on the one hand side, it is clear that we have to act to save costs, to drive innovation and agility, and we've discussed that at the beginning of this webinar. And on the other hand, we have to make all these fundamental decisions, and we have to get them right from the get-go about which platform suits best to my strategy, which deployment model makes most sense to start with, i.e., is that a private, a public, or even a hybrid cloud model, and how do I want to approach the entire migration and transformation. And then oftentimes, what we also have to do is to convince other internal stakeholders, such as the CIO, the CFO, the CEO, and we have to convince them that the path we propose is exactly the right one. So we have a very high level of complexity, and this is exactly where we try to support our customers. And we do that with something we call cloud assessment at T-Systems. And as a first step, we try to break down this complexity. So we start with, firstly, to create transparency about the application landscape and infrastructure. And I just mentioned when I talked about the challenges, why this is so important, that I have full transparency about the entire landscape. And the larger the organization you work for, the more difficult that really is, because there often organizations work in silos. So even within central IT, infrastructure teams work completely autonomously from application teams. And then you have all the other complexity in terms of your organization setup, with country organizations, with business units driving their own projects, and so on. Secondly, we talk to relevant stakeholders to understand compliance requirements and security concerns for all business applications in scope, right? So, and in those two steps, we already start bringing the organization together, right? We speak to infrastructure stakeholders, application stakeholders, we speak to security, we talk to application owners. So we're trying to get this holistic picture, which we need to start the cloud transformation and the cloud journey. And based on this allows us then to start planning migration scenarios for every single business applications. And I say migration scenarios because often customers don't only ask us to come up with one migration path, but they actually want to compare different options before they actually start to make these crucial decisions. And all of that we can, based on that, we can then build a complete cloud business case, which not only includes the migration and transformation efforts, but also the operations cost on the new platform. So that means that we provide our customers with very specific decision criteria, which take into account the overall situation of the customer, which take into account the cloud strategy that we talked about earlier, and the specific infrastructure and application landscape. So if we go a bit more into detail, on this slide, we can see the main steps of such a cloud assessment. And this starts with a technical setup of the tool set, which we use to accelerate the complete engagement and the migration afterwards, by the way, for that matter as well. And here we have the possibility to use different tools depending on the objectives of our customers. So if the customer has already decided for one of the hyperscalers, for AWS or Azure, we can use their native tool set like a Azure Migrate for Azure or like a TSO Logic for AWS. So different tool sets are available from these cloud service providers as well. In a minute, I will very briefly show you a tool which we often use if that decision has not been made, which allows us to very quickly on a high level compare different hyperscalers. So this is really nice if there's a tendency towards public cloud, but the cloud service provider hasn't been selected yet. And lastly, if there's a strong tendency towards private cloud, we have our own tool sets at T-Systems which are optimized for exactly that. So after the technical setup, we then use these tool sets for an automated scan. And we do not only create an inventory of all the infrastructure and all the application components and business application of the environment in scope, but we also measure like communication between these applications and the utilization and performance of the infrastructure. And what that allows us to do is to automatically right-size the infrastructure for every business application on the various platforms that we look into. And thereby, we actually save cost for our customers from the get-go by optimizing before the actual migration. And then in parallel to this scan, and usually we suggest to scan for a period of 2 to 4 weeks in order to capture like performance peaks, especially, right, to get the right sizing as accurate as possible. During that time, our cloud consultants then start speaking to all relevant stakeholders to collect and gather the more qualitative data. So this means we speak to application owners, we speak to security to capture business, compliance, and security requirements for every application. We need to understand which data is stored for each application, what security compliance requirements does that trigger. And then what we do is we combine this technical and qualitative data to define the best and most suitable migration path for every business application or for every application component. Again, also having in mind what the overall customer and cloud vision and strategy should be, because that's a really, really important factor here to decide on which migration path is the right one. And then the different migration paths are here represented by the so-called 6 R's, and that reaches from retired. That means an application is not required anymore. In the future, it can be retired before the migration for various reasons. Either the capabilities of this application are already intrinsically built in on the new platform, or actually there's a server or application idling around and nobody dared to touch it, but we, due to our automated scan, could measure that there's actually no communication, no usage of these components anymore, so we can retire this straight away. And again, these are cost savings from the get-go for our customers, and what we usually see in our assessments that we have roughly 15% in this retired bucket. The other extreme is retained, so that means an application or component cannot be moved, and again, there could be business or technical criteria which trigger this retained bucket. So there could be specific latency requirements. That means an application needs to be very close to a factory, for example, or there could already be a business strategy that this application will be end of life in a couple of months anyway, so we won't touch it. Then moving on, the rehosted bucket is for applications that we just lift and shift. So we don't actually touch the code. The underlying infrastructure does not massively change, which really, this is very light touch, so we just move that over to the new platform. Next one, replatform means is we're not changing the application, we're not changing the code, but we're changing like the underlying platform, and that could be the operating systems, or it could be actually moving from a on-premises database, so a SQL and a SQL database on-premise, to a PaaS service like Azure SQL. And obviously there it is becoming interesting, especially when we talk about public cloud providers and using more of these cloud native services. Then the last 2 R's are refactored. That means we are completely redeveloping applications. Obviously, there's the most effort behind that. We are redeveloping applications, and usually what we start doing then is using more and more cloud native services, making the applications more agile, DevOps style, and also making it cheaper to run these applications. And lastly, repurchase would be moving to a software as a service offering. So moving from an on-premise Exchange server, for example, to an Office 365, the example that I also mentioned earlier. So we undergo this exercise here. We define the migration paths for every single business application component, and then based on that, we provide customers with all the relevant documentation and outcomes, and I'll share that in a minute. So what I just want to very quickly do is to show you how such a tool like Cloudomize, which I mentioned earlier, works. And again, this is only an example. If the decision has not been made on which hyperscaler I actually want to move, and if there's a focus on public cloud for that matter as well. So, but what we can see here, and all of that information has been gathered automatically, so there was no consulting or interaction required so far. So what we see here is a very high-level comparison of the different cloud platforms, including some cost estimates already as well. And if I dive into like one of the platforms now, I get much more granularity. So here I can see really the technical and business and application data that has been collected, including the recommended instances on the hyperscalers, the associated cost. And as I said, this has all been collected automatically. So there's a lot of high-level assumption which have been made by this tool. But at the next stage, what our consultants would then do with their additional information and the qualitative information they gathered as well is to refine this setup for our customers further. So there's a designer functionality in this tool specifically. So as part of this overall cloud assessment engagement, we really tailor that to the specific business needs of our customers. And then lastly, the second screen I want to show you as well is this then also allows us to actually plan the migration. And when I mentioned earlier that we not only accelerate the cloud assessment, but also the cloud migration afterwards, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So here we can really build, like from an application perspective, the different groups. We see all the communication between the applications, the underlying infrastructure, so we can map all of that out. And based on that, then define the actual move groups for the migration. And then we have an automated interface from this tool here to the migration tools. And again, it would depend on what the target platform is, which tool we would use. But if it's AWS, obviously we would use something like Cloud Endure, so the cloud native tooling, or we would again use Azure Migrate if it's an Azure platform, or other tools if the tendency is more towards a private cloud platform. So just a very short demo, and if you're interested to see that in more detail, again, please ask a question, or we'll also share my contact details later on. So I'm more than happy to schedule a more detailed demo and obviously talk about everything in more detail as well. So once we've completed all of that, we document all of our findings for our customers, so they can use this documentation to then move on with the systems, or internally, or with any other provider as well, to be honest, which is not preferred, but which is possible. So the deliverables and outcomes from such an assessment are, firstly, we provide an executive summary, and here you will find all the relevant information for top management, and this primarily means the business cases for the different scenarios, right? So what are the associated costs? What is the migration transformation effort? What will be the cost on the future platform or platforms that we look into? Secondly, we have the technical documentation, and that includes the complete inventory, so all the technical infrastructure and application data that we have collected, including the defined migration paths and associated costs. And you can see here, like this includes also the future architectures, and on a very granular level, again, the migration paths and associated cost for all the components. So this is really a great level of detail and a very helpful breakdown of the whole infrastructure and landscape. And lastly, we deliver the final report, which is a detailed documentation of all the findings, all the assumptions, all the results and migration concepts for the future design. So in total, this really gives you all the information you need to kick off and start your cloud migration. Right. So as I promised, I have brought along a couple of customer examples, and I would like to very quickly go through 4 customer examples, also to demonstrate how different the objectives can be depending on where the customers currently are on their cloud journey. And this first example from the oil and gas industry, that is actually a pipeline construction company, right? And they turned to T-Systems at a very interesting point in time. So this company has been responsible to build a pipeline for, I think, for the last 10 years, and they were coming closer to the point where they completed construction. And what I learned then is this would mean for them to completely change their business model, because they would transform from a pipeline construction company to a pipeline operator, right? So completely different business, completely different organizational structure, completely different budgets, and also completely different requirements to IT. So this company turned to us with the challenge that they would completely transform their business in a couple of months, and that would mean primarily also that their IT budget would reduce by at least 50% over the next 12 months. But on the other hand side, that would also mean that certain business applications are not required anymore, that certain data can be archived, that not so many users need access to certain applications. They already had decided that they want to go on that journey with Microsoft and Azure, but they needed a plan how to get there and how to get their budget down by at least 50%. So what we were able to do for them is, with our cloud assessment, get transparency on all the infrastructure, discuss with the application owners and the business what the new requirements are, which applications are required in which form in the future, and how can we build an ideal architecture on Azure in order to accomplish these objectives. So this entire exercise we completed in only 8 weeks. We showed them a concept and which allowed them to reduce their TCO by 60%. And they are now starting with their migration to Azure. And by the way, whilst they had made their decision for Azure, they were quite happy for us to also in parallel do a benchmark against AWS, just to double check that they had made the right decision there. So second use case, very different scenario, right? And this company was at a very different stage. So this company, and it's one of the examples where the CIO actually turned to us and said, well, I'm lacking control and transparency to start with. And this company had 14 data centers, hundreds of servers across the world, most of them operated by local business units. So outside of reach for central IT, really. But the board of this company had decided to potentially consolidate, but they had made the final decision. So they really turned to us and said, T-Systems, can you help us to build a high-level business case to understand whether such a consolidation program would make sense? And again, we started by creating this transparency across the organization, and then start building only very high-level business cases and with different deployment scenarios as well. So we looked into private cloud options, we looked into public cloud options, and also in hybrid scenarios where, like, the production workloads, for example, would go to a private cloud platform, but the non-production workloads and workloads would go to a public cloud platform. And like, depending on the scenario, we were able to show that with a pure lift and shift and rehost approach, this company would be able to save 20 to 30 %, which made that a viable business case and allowed the board again to make an educated decision to move on with the consolidation program. Third example, again very differently, because this company had already all their scope running on a private cloud platform. And it was already largely optimized. So they didn't have any immediate need to move everything, like the first two examples. But what they actually asked us to do is to scan their current environment, firstly, to understand whether they can save any additional cost on this private cloud platform. So again, we created transparency with a focus on right sizing this time. And we were able to demonstrate and show them that they could not massively save costs because, as I said, it was already largely optimized, but they could save costs in the range of 10 to 15% on their current platform by right-sizing the existing private cloud platform. So this then in turn allowed them to unlock additional budget and to continue on their Azure and migration journey, which they had already started, and they are still in the process of gradually moving onto Azure. They have decided to go application by application, but with a focus on complete architecting these applications for the cloud native platform already. And then the last example and the last use case for a chemicals company with 2 data centers, so not massively, but reasonable size, with a broad mix of applications from SAP over non-SAP to Office 365. And this company had already built out their cloud strategy, so they had defined on a high level what they want to achieve, but they haven't made a decision on which cloud service provider and which platform would be the right one for them. So whilst they were sure they wanted to go to public cloud, and they were sure they wanted to either select Azure, so Microsoft, or AWS, they asked us to compare the 2 different platforms for them with a detailed cloud assessment and a path and migration path to either of these platforms with an associated business case. All right, let me summarize what we discussed so far and some of the most important recommendations. So firstly, make sure that you know where you are on your cloud journey. And our cloud maturity model that I showed in the beginning can actually help you to give some orientation and guidance as to where you are on this journey and also what the most important steps are for each stage. Secondly, if you are right at the beginning of your cloud journey, or if you, for whatever reason, have not done it yet, define your cloud vision, define your cloud strategy, and statements like we want to save cost or we have a cloud first strategy are not sufficient here. You have to define with your leadership team which role IT should play in the overall business in the future. Thirdly, define decision criteria and get transparency, right? Get transparency over the entire landscape that is potentially in scope for a cloud transformation. Based on that, build a cloud business case or build different cloud business cases. So make this scenario planning to then select the right scenario which exactly fits your strategy and fits the objectives that you set out in the beginning. And then lastly, based on this information, you can then develop this long-term roadmap that includes the technical migration, but also how processes and the organization have to change in order to make full use of all the advantages that cloud can offer. Right. And this concludes my presentation, and I would be delighted to answer some of your questions. So if you haven't done it yet, please use the chat box, the question box, and whilst I'll open that up here on my screen, as I said earlier, please feel free to reach out to me. You can see my email address here. Please link into me. You can find me on LinkedIn under Jonas Niessen, and I will check whether there are questions. So the first question is, in one of your examples, the migration to public cloud resulted in significant cost savings. In my experience, public cloud is more expensive than on-premise and private cloud solutions. How did you achieve these cost savings? And this is a very fair point. we're making here. So, and maybe I haven't made this transparent enough, right? So by just moving what you have to a different platform, very, very rarely you actually save any cost. But there are a couple of levers here. Also in a pure lift and shift scenario, that how you can actually save cost on a new platform. And some of the examples I mentioned, one would be the right sizing aspect and making use of the flexibility you have in ramping up and ramping down compute and storage in a matter of seconds and minutes. And that also applies to a second example that I have in mind, where you could, for example, implement automated start-stop for your infrastructure. So what we have implemented for other customers is, like, for all the non-production systems during non-business hours, they would automatically stop the virtual machines, and thereby, due to the pay-as-you-go model, customers don't pay anymore. And then the other aspect to that is, like, the 6 R's that I mentioned. So the retire piece, where we see 15% on average in custom landscapes, which are cost saving straight away. And then there's going more into cloud native technology with replatforming, refactoring, also repurchasing. So what we, like, in almost all the engagements, customers ask us to look into Office 365 to replace their on-premises Exchange and SharePoint servers, and also with that, this generates great cost savings. Then the next question is, how much does this assessment typically cost? And the answer is, yeah, it really depends. So there are two drivers for the cost. One is the size of the environment, so the number of servers and business applications we analyze. And the other factor is, how deep should we analyze that? So, and the two extremes are, like, I showed the use case, I think it was use case 3, where this was only a high-level business case, a 3 weeks engagement. So this is obviously less effort than really looking in detail and planning out, like, the two completely different scenarios for AWS and Azure, including all the architecture and migration plans. But if you are interested to get, like, a more concrete cost estimate, please feel free to send me an email to jonas.niessen@tsystems.com, and more than happy to get back to you. Then there's a question: is your maturity model based on CMMI? Our maturity model is largely oriented on the cloud adoption frameworks from the hyperscalers. So I'm not entirely sure, but I can take this question away whether this is also in line with CCNI, but I would have to come back to you on this one. So again, if you could shoot me a short email, I will find a better answer to this question. All right, let's give it like one more minute to see whether there are more questions coming up. Okay, this does not seem to be the case. So I would like to thank all of you for taking the time, for joining me today. Again, please feel free to link into me, to reach out to me. More than happy to go to the next level of detail, or also touch on every other aspect of cloud and your cloud journey that might be relevant for you. So thanks a lot for your time. Hopefully talk to you soon, and have a great day.